This program is made possible by the loyal financial support of the friends and partners of Family Policy Institute.
You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world.
Welcome to Salt and Light. Tonight, we report back on a victory at the United Nations in New York. 2 weeks ago, Sharon Slater, the president of the UN Family Rights Caucus in New York, sent me an urgent email requesting help from South African citizens to stop the war on children being waged at the United Nations. She was referring to the comprehensive sexuality education agenda being advanced at the UN by radical sexual rights activists. The reason Sharon needed the help of South African citizens is because South Africa is the only African nation at the UN to endorse and support comprehensive sexuality education. Parts of this evil agenda against children have already been implemented in South Africa. Condoms are being distributed to increasingly younger children. However, I want to extend my gratitude and appreciation to every South African that signed the letter to the UN. Family Policy Institute is a member of the UN Family Rights Caucus. We work diligently along with our international partners to defend biblical marriage, the natural family, and parental rights. The latest news from Family Watch International reads, the battle to protect family life and children at the UN Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, concluded at about midnight on Thursday, March 24. Family Watch was there with a terrific team of 22 volunteers from the United States, Portugal, Kenya, Nigeria, Haiti, and Argentina. As usual, Western countries attempted again at this year's CSW to force their sexual rights and abortion agenda on developing countries, and this includes, obviously, South Africa. Also, as usual, there was a lot that was good, a lot that was bad, and a number of things that were downright ugly. Direct references to comprehensive sexuality education was deleted from the main CSW outcome document called Agreed, as well as from the HIV/AIDS resolution. Since this was one of the major goals of Family Watch team, we could not be more pleased, Sharon writes. This is a major victory for the protection of children worldwide. However, the battle to indoctrinate children with the diabolical sexual rights agenda will continue at the United Nations and at our parliament here in South Africa. This is why we will show you the documentary entitled The War on Children, the Comprehensive Sexuality Education Agenda. This documentary is a must-see for every parent of young children and even teens. But before we show you the documentary, you need to hear from Sharon Slater, the president of Family Watch International at the UN, and also the UN Family Rights Caucus organization. Family Policy Institute is a partner member of the World Congress of Families. We caught up with Sharon at the World Congress in Salt Lake City, Utah in the United States recently and spoke to her about her vital work at the UN. Following this interview with Sharon Slater, we will show you the 35-minute documentary that may shock you. However, you must be informed about the harmful agenda against our children so you can recognize and oppose this dangerous threat against biblical values. Great privilege to be speaking to Sharon Slater, the president of Family Watch International here in the United States of America, and also the president of the Family Rights Caucus at the United Nations. Now, we're at the World Congress of Families in Salt Lake City in Utah, and Sharon, it's such a great privilege to speak to you because you've been such a great help to us in South Africa with the work that you do. But tell us a little bit about Family Watch International. What does the organization do?
Well, we work to protect the family by protecting marriage, life, religious freedom, and especially parental rights, because Right now, there is a huge assault on our children and their sexuality, and it's important to preserve parental rights to protect our children.
So most of the work you're doing at the United Nations is to stop a lot of this language getting into the resolutions that undermine marriage, family, children's sexuality. And one of the issues that is big on the radar now is comprehensive sexuality education. Tell us what that means.
It's a very deceptive term. At the United Nations, you'll hear that comprehensive sexuality education will lift people out of poverty. It'll prevent teen pregnancy. It'll prevent domestic abuse. It'll promote gender equality. They've even said it will help with climate change. I mean, the claims are so ridiculous. And so they get it in all these resolutions. They get governments to sign on to it and say, we need comprehensive sexuality education. And they never show them what's in the manuals. What's in the manuals are insidious, they're explicit, they're pornographic, and they're designed to sexualize children and to change all the gender and sexual norms of our societies.
And obviously, if they're working at the United Nations, they're trying to get it into the documentation so that they can change the laws of countries all over the world, including South Africa.
In fact, they falsely claim that comprehensive sexuality education is already an international right. The UN rapporteur on the right to education, he's supposed to be the expert to tell the UN how do we solve all the education problems. He gave a report to the General Assembly, and instead of saying we need to get more children into schools, he said the problem is not enough children are having this comprehensive sexuality education. And he actually said that they need to know about sexual pleasure, about not having guilt feelings about eroticism. They need to learn about homosexuality. They need to learn all these things that are really not appropriate for children.
And why do they need to?
Adults.
And why do they need to learn that? What is his rationale?
Well, there is this agenda behind it. He says, this is really fascinating, how they take the right to education and they say, okay, there's a right to education, so in order to have education and have good sexual and reproductive health, you need education about sexual and reproductive health. Well, sexual health, well, they say you need comprehensive education about sexual health, so therefore you need to know everything under the sun, including sexual pleasure, how to do different sexual acts. They tell children it's okay as long as it's consensual. You can do anything you want. Here's how to do it. Here's how to get sexual pleasure. And they're actually promoting worldwide this right to sexual pleasure for children. I have to give you a specific example because I know this sounds outrageous and most people won't believe it, but you could Google right now, the World Health Organization, they're supposed to be protecting the health of everybody in the world, right? They issued the sexuality standards for Europe, okay? This is for education of children, 0 to 4. We're talking newborns to 4 years old. They say that they need to learn about touching their body parts to get sexual pleasure or masturbation, okay? Now you think about it, how could a newborn do this? They would need adults to help them, right? They can't even physically do it at newborn age. So where this leads to is so
this is in documents in the United Nations.
Produced by the World Health Organization. You've got UNESCO. They published the sexuality standards that were supposed to go for education to go to every health education department in the world. And they had the same thing. You need to teach children about sexual pleasure, touching your body parts. They started at age 5. They need to learn how they can have sexual pleasure with the same sex, the opposite sex, all these different sexual rights. They teach them they have a right to abortion and they can go out and advocate for abortion. These programs are designed to change our societies and the very fundamental religious and cultural values that hold our societies together, to throw those out the window and change and have our children advocating for these radical, controversial sexual rights.
Tell us about the brochures that you picked up from Planned Parenthood Federation. What they were promoting to young children, I think it was called HOT.
Healthy, happy, and hot.
There we go.
Yes.
What was in that thing?
Well, unbelievably, I picked it up at a UN meeting that was designed to invite children to come and learn. It was under the auspices of the Girl Scouts, okay? And they wouldn't even let me in. They said it was only children, no adults could come in, which is not what happens at UN meetings. So this was very strange. I waited outside the room and I wanted to see what they were teaching. So as soon as it was over, I found this big stack of Healthy, Happy, and Hot, published by International Planned Parenthood Federation. This pamphlet is designed for HIV-infected youth. And it teaches them about all their sexual rights. They have this right to sexual pleasure, but the most insidious thing, besides showing them how to do different sexual acts and teaching them they can have sex when they're drunk and it doesn't matter, they say that a youth does not have to tell their sexual partners that they're infected with HIV, that they get to decide when and who and if they disclose their status. Can you imagine? Can you imagine telling people, youth affected with HIV, that it's a violation of their international rights to have to tell their sexual partners?
I'm trying to imagine how that would work in South Africa, because we have such high rates of infections of HIV/AIDS.
This drives the very behavior that they're saying that they are trying to prevent. And International Planned Parenthood is put forward at the United Nations as a super NGO, this super organization that gets the premier speaking slots. They get millions of dollars from UN agencies. They have 65,000 service points in 170 countries. In the United States, they say on their website, they're the largest provider of comprehensive sexuality education. But I want you to think about this. People say, no, this can't be true. Well, why would they be sexualizing children? This must be a lie. You're exaggerating. But think about it. It's a business. It's a marketing plan. All their lawyers are at every UN conference, and they're manipulating even the regional negotiations, the negotiations of the UN. If they can sexualize a child at a very young age, that child is going to come to them. In fact, many of the manuals, in fact, the World Health Organization manual teaches children that they have to go to Planned Parenthood to learn about their sexual rights. So if they sexualize them, what's that child going to need? Sexual counseling, condoms, contraceptives. The Guttmacher Institute, which is the research arm of Planned Parenthood, they have a study that shows that children who are using a condom and having sex over a 2-year period, they're going to end up getting pregnant 25% of the time. So they're going to get pregnant, they're going to need, then they provide them with abortions. If you look at what's been happening in the United States with the investigations, we know that Planned Parenthood is also profiting from selling the body parts of the abortions.
And making money out of it, profiting off the broken and destroyed lives of young people. Now, in South Africa, Planned Parenthood Federation supports a campaign called Love Life. And they're involved in that. And when I investigated Love Life's material, I found similar things that you're talking about to what you picked up, the brochure at the United Nations, where they're teaching people, young people, between the ages of 12, 13 to 17, to experiment with same-sex relationships and with all kinds of bizarre sexual behaviors. And I'm trying to understand, we're talking about high-risk behaviors here. Why would you, if you're fighting HIV/AIDS, why would you be teaching and promoting high-risk behaviors to children?
It's because this is not about health. It's not about sexual health. It's about sexual rights. And I was just talking to a doctor, Dr. Miriam Grossman, and she does this really well, but she talks about sexual health is incompatible with sexual rights as far as what they want people to be doing. If you follow the sexual rights agenda, you cannot have sexual health. It's simply too dangerous. And this is something you need to understand. UNAIDS, the UN agency charged with stopping the AIDS pandemic in the whole world, and they get millions of dollars from governments and the UN. Guess what they say is the way to prevent AIDS? They have their international guidelines on HIV/AIDS and human rights. You see, it's this rights approach. It's not a health approach, it's a rights approach to preventing AIDS. And they say that part of this plan to stop AIDS is you have to legalize abortion, legalize same-sex marriage, legalize sex work, in other words, there's sexual encounters, prostitution, and give this sexuality education to children. Now, these are the very things that actually drive the AIDS pandemic.
That's right.
Right? So if we have the premier agency doing this, you can tell that the institutions at the United Nations have all been manipulated. They're really just like super NGOs of the Western countries pushing this agenda. The Western countries provide most of the budgets for the UN agencies, and then they control the agenda, which again, it's sexual rights, not sexual health. Sex outside of marriage. It doesn't matter if it's heterosexual, homosexual, premarital, adulterous. Well, and I'm not going to even make a right or wrong argument, because our organization takes its position based on social science data and public health. I mean, we can make a social science, any sexual relations outside of married, faithful relationship brings all sorts of negative consequences, and so agenda is actually destroying the foundations of society. It's destroying marriage, and it's destroying and corrupting our children.
Yeah, men and women suffer. Children
Yes.
are devastated by this behavior. Whole societies are struggling. You look at South African society. How many people are on welfare? How many children are, because of teenage pregnancies, abortions, all of these things, their lives have been destroyed because of this agenda. Yet it's been pushed by the United Nations, by the American government and Western European governments, and ordinary people can't get a hold on this. They can't understand why people are pushing this, especially when it is so harmful to so many people. But Sharon, I want to talk more to you. We're going to go for a break about your work at the UN, who you are, how you do this work, and a little bit more about the agendas being driven at the United Nations.
Great.
So don't go away. More with Sharon Slater. Have you ever dreamt of visiting Israel? Of seeing your Bible come to life as you walk the streets of Nazareth where Jesus lived? Worship on a boat on the Sea of Galilee and see where he performed his miracles? Pray with hundreds of believers at the Wailing Wall or get baptized in the Jordan River? Now you can do all of this with Joy Magazine and myself, Errol Naidoo. Join me on a 10-day tour to Israel and Egypt from 22nd to 31st October 2016. But hurry, places are limited. Email info@joymag.co.za for more. Welcome back to the program. I'm speaking to Sharon Slater, the president of Family Watch International based in the United States of America. She's also the president of the Family Rights Caucus at the United Nations, doing excellent work. Now, people watching this program, Sharon, would think that you trained for all of this. Somebody trained you, and you've got a couple of degrees, and you're going to the United Nations as part of a big group. How did this all start? How did you end up at the United Nations? Because you're a housewife with 5 children from
7.
7 children.
3 adopted from Mozambique.
3. Okay, that's right. From Phoenix, Arizona. How did you end up doing this work, the incredible work you do at the United Nations?
Well, in 1999, I was a stay-at-home mom, and I'd never been involved in anything politically. And I got invited to a World Congress of Families, and this is, that was back in 1999, and here we are today at a World Congress of Families.
The 9th one.
Yes. And I got invited by an organization there to come to a UN conference, and I'd heard there's this battle over the family's controversial, and I thought, that's so foreign. I had a hard time believing it. I wanted to see it for myself. So they sent me into a negotiation room, and they said, write down anything positive about the family. And what I was hearing was so radical and strange, and all this rhetoric that I thought, I wonder if anybody in the world knew what they were talking about in here, and were these really policies that governments would implement? Because it was different representatives from all these different governments. And then finally, a delegate raised her hand and said, I think we need to put in here respect for religious and cultural values. We as nations need to respect this. And you would have thought she said the most controversial thing in the world. They were all attacking her and saying, no, you have to show it's been in past UN documents, you don't have citations. And I started shaking because I knew that I had the citation she needed in my bag in the corner of the room. I had been to a little seminar at the World Congress of Families, and they'd given me this little pamphlet with all the good language from past UN treaties on this. I didn't know what I could do. Would they throw me out? Could I approach her? And I got my nerve up, and I got behind her, and I stuck it on her lap. And she looked down. She had the very citations she needed. She raised her hand. She read them off, and she won the argument.
Wow.
Yeah. And
there you were.
And she asked for a break, and she pulled me out in the hall, and she said, who are you? And you know what? I was just a mom, but I was a mom, and I happened to be at the right place at the right time with a tool that impacted a policy that could affect the whole world. And I was astounded by that. I thought, if I could do that without knowing anything and stumbling in with no experience, what could happen if I studied? What could happen if I brought other people? What if we had more formal materials on all the different issues to help? What if we could create talking points? And so that's what we've been doing. And over the last 15, 16 years, we've made great relationships with African governments, Islamic governments, the Caribbean islands. Russia is a great ally, the Holy See. There's kind of this coalition of governments that are standing up against this agenda to sexualize our children, to radicalize and change our religious and cultural values throughout the world. And so now we put formal trainings on, we prepare UN diplomats for the battle, and they're standing up. In fact, I think it's important for your audience to know that it's Africa that is really saving the whole world on these issues.
Except for South Africa.
Except for South Africa. That's very, very important. They try, what they've been doing is like the United States and the European governments, they've manipulated the South African delegation to try to break off the consensus of the whole African voting bloc. And a lot of times they'll get South Africa to propose all the really controversial things to make it look like it's coming out of Africa. So this, you know, South Africa taking up this agenda is really hurting all the interests of Africa generally.
But the reality, Sharon, is that South Africa is policy-wise separated from the rest of Africa. We don't belong in Africa. We're more like a Western European nation because of our policies. We've legalized everything that is harmful to the family, and the rest of Africa has been holding the fort. So that is a huge problem, and that's why I've signed on to be a member of the Family Rights Caucus at the United Nations. Family Policy Institute is a member of the Family Rights Caucus. I want to get up to the United Nations at some time.
We need you there. We need you there. We need you to be talking to the South Africans, saying, because I do not believe that the majority of South Africans have bought into this sexual rights.
No, they haven't.
I don't believe that the majority of South Africans want this radical, pornographic, comprehensive sexuality education for their children. I think the problem is they just don't know. The information is not getting out far enough and wide enough. And if enough people knew in South Africa, especially parents, you would not have the policies that you do.
No, I agree with you, because if you did a survey in South Africa today, you'd find that the vast majority of people do not agree with abortion on demand. The wide availability of pornography on television, on the internet, all of these things is not. The majority of people in South Africa hold a traditional view of family. This has been imposed on them by a liberal government that don't often hear the voice of the people. That's our problem in South Africa. And that's why even the representative, South African representative at the UN, is doing things that most South Africans are not aware of. That's why I was so excited to meet you a couple of years ago. You remember when we met in Moscow, in Russia? Was that last year?
Was it 2 years ago?
Yeah,
I don't even remember now.
I can't remember, but you wanted to take my wife and I with you to Geneva. You said, come with me, hop on the plane.
We need you to shake things up there.
Absolutely. You were fighting, and South Africa was serving on that committee.
The Human Rights Council.
And you were pushing through. You needed all the help you could get to push through a pro-family resolution that has gone through.
Yes, it has.
Thank God for that.
Victory.
And you did a lot of work on that. You did a lot of work. Citizen Go helped. We got stuff out in South Africa. A lot of people signed on to that. I sent it out on my newsletter.
We thank the South African people. We thank everyone who sent emails and supported this, because this is a phenomenal thing, a protection of the family resolution coming out of the United Nations.
Just explain what that important quote in that resolution was that is so critical for marriage and family.
Thank you. There's a number of them. It's 8 pages of really good stuff. But the main quote in there it comes from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it says that the family is entitled to protection by society and state, but it's the family as the natural and fundamental group unit of society. It recognizes this. Then it recognizes the role of family in nurturing children. You know, we're seeing this huge separation. They're trying to separate children from their parents and then get to their children. This is no, it's children, it's the family where the children need to be nurtured.
Children need a mom and a dad. And that resolution recognizes that, even though there's a huge push against it. And I know the United States and the UK and these other liberal governments were trying to push against that, to include other languages, to recognize all forms of families. But Russia was the main nation that helped push this through. And South Africa voted with Russia.
Yes, and I'd like to say, sometimes you have a good delegate representing South Africa that is and they supported this, and this was a big thing. But the majority of the time,
Yes,
that's not the case. And it's interesting for every country. A lot of times it matters who's sitting in the seat, what is their personal value on this, which is kind of ironic since they're representing their country.
So, I put a goal and a faith goal that my wife and I want to travel up to Phoenix to come and train with you, get some diplomatic training, and in 2016 at least 1 week at the United Nations in New York to come and work with Sharon and the Family Rights Caucus, Austin Roos and all of the other people.
You could bring your film team and you could film and show everybody the battle at the United Nations.
And the battles you're fighting is so critical because it affects all nations in the world. You're fighting at the United Nations where almost 200 nations are represented, and whatever gets through there affects all of these nations, including South Africa. All the African nations are impacted by this. So your work is so critical. And of course, the newsletters you send out, it is so helpful to me in my work. It helps me such a lot because I know what's happening on a global scale. Even though we're working locally, I know what's going on globally, and that's so important to the work we do. The documentaries that you produce, the cultural imperialism, sexual rights agenda, because that's an expose of what is happening in the world, really happening. And then of course the porn pandemic. That is such a great documentary, helping people understand how harmful, how destructive pornography is to women, to children, to men, and to society at large. But Sharon, we want to thank you. My wife and I are huge fans of Sharon Slater.
Well, I am a huge fan of you and your wife. What you are doing in Africa and in South Africa particularly is so needed. I mean, to have the real voice, the voice of truth, of what's really happening and what these words really mean and what these agendas really are, this is critical. Absolutely. To the families in Africa. And I am so grateful. I'm grateful you're going to come to the UN. I can't imagine the good that will come of it. And I look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
It's going to be wonderful.
God bless you.
Thank you.
Have you ever dreamt of visiting Israel? Of seeing your Bible come to life as you walk the streets of Nazareth where Jesus lived? Worship on a boat on the Sea of Galilee and see where he performed his miracles? Pray with hundreds of believers at the Wailing Wall or get baptized in the Jordan River? Now you can do all of this with Joy Magazine and myself, Errol Naidoo. Join me on a 10-day tour to Israel and Egypt from 22nd to 31st October 2016. But hurry, places are limited. Email info@joymag.co.za for more.
In this film, the term Comprehensive Sexuality Education, or CSE, does not refer to sex education programs in general, but rather to a specific form of graphic sexuality education. CSE is designed to change the sexual and gender norms of society, promotes high-risk sexual behaviors, and encourages even the youngest of children to experiment sexually. For the protection of the viewer, explicit images from CSE text that will be shown have been blurred out. However, the subject matter is still not appropriate for children.
This is definitely an attack on healthy family life. It will affect your economy. It will affect your child rearing. It will affect your education system.
This has horrified a lot of people in South Africa. And the tool that is being used, the weapons that are being used, is comprehensive sexuality education.
As president of the American College of Pediatricians, I am deeply concerned about comprehensive sexuality education for 4 reasons. First, it sexualizes children. Second, it threatens children's health. Third, it promotes a dangerous gender ideology. And fourth, it undermines the parent-child relationship, which violates parental rights.
My life's work has been to protect children by exposing the roots of the sexual revolution, the sexual rights movement that's led to sex education worldwide, globally.
Say not to CSC! Say not to CSC! Say not to CSC!
There is a worldwide war raging across the globe. Not a war of guns and weapons, but a war of ideas, ideologies, and worldviews regarding sex.
This is just part of the lesson plan for what's called Making a Difference curriculum, and it is in Oregon schools and probably schools around the nation. This is instructions for the teacher in the classroom to ask her or his students, how do people express their sexual feelings? What is abstinence? And here are some answers that they try to elicit from the children. Oral sex, masturbation, anal sex, massage, holding hands, touching each other's genitals, saying, I like you. And what they're doing is equating all these things. Saying, I like you is equal to anal sex.
Planned Parenthood is coming into classrooms of students who are 13 and 14 years old. They're giving them handouts, negotiating sexual encounters with other students. For example, there are statements like this: do you want to go back to my room? Do you want to get busy? Can I take your shirt off? It makes me hot when you touch me. Here, can you do that? Is it okay if I take my pants off? This is outrageous. This should not be taught in the classroom.
We are state legislators from Minnesota, and we are pushing hard against the agenda to sexualize our children.
Minnesota is on the leading edge of this radical agenda, and we're trying our best to fight against it.
They're pushing a comprehensive sexual education agenda, including the book, It's Perfectly Normal.
It is pornography. It is something that even some of my colleagues, men especially on the House floor, did not want to look at. Showing children as young as 4th grade. In fact, it's recommended for 4th graders as their comprehensive sex education. We couldn't show this on the television news, but yet we want our 4th grade children to be looking at this book.
When a child looks at a pornographic image within 0.3 of a second, that's imprinted on his brain and her brain permanently. We know that there's an action that takes place which is called mirroring images, so that children will want to or will act out what they see. In the name of sexuality education, children are seeing obscene materials that have been ruled by Congress and by the Supreme Court impossible to show to children.
Where we in Latin America, we still have a lot of poverty. We have communities that don't have fresh water, that don't have electricity, children that cannot finish even primary school. Focus is completely shifted from basic needs to this very idealized agenda. They get comprehensive sexual education without the consent of parents, taking and deconstructing the family.
They have really concerning campaigns for children. The strongest one is we demand sexual education, impossible to live without it. One of them is called Put It On. They have elementary students as young as 9 years old. Then they teach them how to wear a condom. And they have this plastic genitalia, and they even have young girls. They're teaching them how to put a condom on a male genitalia and boys how to put a condom on a women's genitalia without the knowledge and consent of the parents.
Most people are unaware that International Planned Parenthood Federation, also known as IPPF, is one of the largest providers of graphic, comprehensive sexuality education programs. With 65,000 service points in over 170 countries, this should concern governments and parents everywhere.
My brother Luigi and I had an opportunity to go to the United Nations and give a speech on the UN floor. First, my brother explained about how we became orphans when both of our parents died of AIDS. I told him how Planned Parenthood was passing out a booklet for HIV-positive youth at the United Nations called Healthy, Happy, and Hot. This is for the kids who have AIDS. The booklet says its purpose, and I quote, to support your sexual pleasure. It tells youth they can have sex in different ways. It teaches about sexual pleasure through masturbation, with same-sex partners, and even if you are drunk.
One of the most disturbing things I think that I've ever seen as a physician, this pamphlet called Healthy, Happy, and Hot, put out by International Planned Parenthood Federation, tells young people, and you have the right not to disclose your HIV status to a sexual partner if you're not comfortable.
I was just so offended. at the booklet that Planned Parenthood put out, inviting people living with HIV to engage in the very acts that would harm them.
It's all about rights instead of health. It also tells young people that are HIV positive that if they decide with their partner not to wear a condom, that's their decision. It's just this kind of information. It's so unbelievable to me as a physician.
This kind of message was a death sentence to not only both of my parents, but also my brother Rogerio.
I couldn't understand how a pro-abortion or abortion service provider in the United States of America was in South Africa and promoting the homosexual lifestyle. Here we're trying to protect young people from getting HIV/AIDS, and we're promoting a lifestyle that is very high risk.
In Guatemala, an affiliate of Planned Parenthood is huge. They have more than 2,600 service points, 27 permanent clinics, and 5 mobile units.
Planned Parenthood became very active in the 90s in Russia after the collapse of Soviet Union. They would provide textbooks for the Russian Ministry of Education and penetrate the official educational networks. Some of those textbooks were really bad and tried really to sexualize children.
The Swedish Planned Parenthood presented a film of about 30 minutes, an animated film which is addressed to young people of 13 to 14 years old. It is called Sex on the Map. In this film, the young people are taught that anything is okay as long as you agree and it feels right for you.
International Planned Parenthood Federation, especially in the Latin American region, is omnipresent. Be it at the mission at the United Nations, the person, for example, working on the actual language, drafting the document, is a direct International Planned Parenthood affiliate. We see the same thing in the Mexican government. They're usually the #1 advisor to the mission. They have a direct influence on the outcome documents, on what is established, what is negotiated at the UN.
Planned Parenthood is one of the largest organizations in the world pushing sexual health and reproductive rights. What they mean by that is not so much about reproducing. It's not about health care for babies, for mothers who want to have babies. It's trying to prevent the birth of babies.
Many of the key players that are advisors to the representatives of various countries, they're actually directly linked to International Planned Parenthood Federation. It's really striking how International Planned Parenthood Federation plays such a big role, and what we just can't put our finger on is how that happened.
Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood Federation, she was part of the eugenics movement that she referred to black people as the weeds of society. She believed in this ideology that the weak people in society should be weeded out.
They masquerade themselves as an agency here to help Africa plan its population. What they're trying to do is to suppress the African population.
They do it through education, making sure that whatever reproductive health care is wanted is in the direction of not having children.
The It's All One curriculum, also promoted by International Planned Parenthood, reveals the multiple manipulative tactics used to indoctrinate and sexualize children through CSE. Like other CSE programs, It's All One claims, among other things, to be evidence-based, comprehensive, human rights, gender-sensitive, and culturally appropriate education that will increase young people's responsible decision-making, to reduce adolescent rates of pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections, including HIV. It's All One, however, like most CSE programs, is really just cleverly disguised abortion rights, sexual pleasure education, masquerading as human rights, gender, and sexual and reproductive health education. It indoctrinates youth in radical feminist ideologies regarding power, privilege, and equality. It aggressively promotes abortion with 112 references to abortion, manipulating young minds using scare tactics, telling girls, every minute of every hour a pregnant girl is dying, so we need to legalize abortion. Students are then required to read stories of girls who have had abortions so they can learn to walk in her shoes in the decision to have an abortion. Like other CSE programs, It's All One has an obsessive focus on sexual pleasure, mentioning sexual pleasure 62 times. It promotes multiple sex acts, the idea that one sexual practice is not better or worse than another, and instructs children on how to stimulate themselves or their partner to orgasm. Children are also asked to read personal stories about feeling sexually attracted to someone of the same sex. It also helps students identify the skills they need to be able to negotiate comfortable sexual relationships, and claims there is no right age to have sex, and that each person has to determine when he or she feels ready to have sex. To explore their readiness, children fill out a worksheet that infers children are ready to have sex when they are feeling close to the other person, when both of you want to have sex, when you are feeling sexually attracted to the other person, and when you're feeling comfortable about telling the other person what feels good sexually. It teaches that human rights encompass sexual rights, including alleged rights to all persons to sexual expression and the right to seek sexual pleasure. Students are also given a list of problems they can work on or advocate for, such as adolescents don't have access to sexual and reproductive health services, and where abortion is illegal, it is dangerous. It's All One curriculum has been in high demand since it was launched several years ago at the United Nations, with requests coming from more than 150 countries and from every state in the United States. This program has been taught to children across the world. It can be difficult to understand why any organization would promote promiscuity and high-risk sexual behaviors to children through comprehensive sexuality education. However, hooking children on sex is a multi-billion-dollar business for Planned Parenthood and other similar organizations. This is because children, or prospects, once sexualized, become Planned Parenthood customers dependent upon their services, and then are turned into peer advocates or educators, recruiting other young people as peer educators to generate even more customers for Planned Parenthood. Some of the lucrative, youth-friendly services Planned Parenthood and their partners provide include sexual and reproductive health counseling, contraceptive counseling, including emergency contraception, abortion services, sexually transmitted infections, including HIV prevention, treatment, and counseling, and now they even provide transgender hormone services. Planned Parenthood aggressively and quite successfully lobbies governments and the United Nations for millions of dollars annually to fund their multiple services and programs, including CSE. Some of their top executives receive high six-figure salaries, yet most governments are completely unaware of their true sexual agenda.
Just looking into the next years in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals that determines the agenda for the next 15 years, the voice is very, very biased. It's just International Planned Parenthood Federation and their affiliates who actually make the suggestions.
The United Nations is also aggressively pushing CSE for children worldwide. A prime example of this is the International Guidelines on Sexuality Education, published by UNESCO in cooperation with UNFPA. Some of the objectives of the UNESCO Sexuality Education Guidelines include teaching children, among other things, at age 5, that masturbation is not harmful, at age 9, about sexual stimulation and the definition and function of orgasm, at age 12, about respect for different sexual orientations and gender identities, and at age 15, that both men and women can receive sexual pleasure with a partner of the same or opposite sex.
When I got to the UN behind closed doors, I was really shocked. Comprehensive sexuality education, which was being pushed at us, really meant encouraging children to experiment sexually.
The comprehensive sexuality education is presented as a silver bullet that would solve all the problems. It's seen as the index to economic growth, as a solution to poverty, as a solution to everything.
Even more disturbing are the World Health Organization standards for sexuality education in Europe. These standards actually suggest that children ages 0 to 4 should be given information about enjoyment and pleasure when touching one's body parts or masturbation, and given the right to explore their gender identities. For ages 4 to 6, children should be taught about same-sex relationships and respect for different norms regarding sexuality. For ages 9 to 12, the differences between gender identity and biological sex, and about their sexual rights as defined by International Planned Parenthood Federation. And finally, for ages 15 and up, children should learn to celebrate sexual differences, about violations of their sexual rights, and their alleged right to abortion. The UN's children's agency, UNICEF, also promotes comprehensive sexuality education, and as far back as 1999, UNICEF was also found to be promoting the sexual pleasure agenda. For example, on page 89 of a UNICEF-published Sexual and Reproductive Health Manual for Pregnant Teens in Mexico, UNICEF listed situations in which one can obtain sexual pleasure that included sexual responses directed towards inanimate objects, animals, minors, and non-consenting persons.
The way they're doing this is to actually penetrate our schools. And so once it changes at the policy level, then we'll probably have no control over what is taught in the schools and who teaches it.
An online CSE program for African youth called The World Starts With Me tells children that sexuality includes French kissing, oral sex, and masturbation. It then tells them it's their own choice if they want to lose their virginity. It shows children pictures of naked girls and boys in various stages of development, and then asks them to point out differences in their private parts. Parents likely will never know, as it is all done online away from home. This program has been found in Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Ghana, and is probably in many other African countries.
We have had several high-level visits to Jamaica and the Caribbean from Prime Minister David Cameron of the UK, from the Secretary General of the UN Ban Ki-moon, and from President Barack Obama. This is about pressuring the Caribbean to accept the sexual rights campaign.
Letters have been written, try to get the Nigerian delegation to actually yield in matters of comprehensive sexuality education.
The UN is for all countries, great and small. As such, it should not be used as a platform to advocate tendencies, ideologies, or ways of life that are at variance with its core principles and mandates.
Many times we're cornered by other delegations seeking to impose a radical sexual agenda.
We were confronted with a text that was replete with controversial issues, extremely divisive in nature.
The Nigerian government was actually told by the Western countries that if they do not give in, that they will be denied foreign aid.
Let me express serious concerns regarding UNFPA's attempt to discredit the government of Nauru and its permanent mission to the United Nations during these negotiations. UNFPA has tried to convince my country to change our positions on issues such as reproductive rights and comprehensive sexuality education. Harassing my capital or going through UNFPA's regional office in the Pacific will not change my country's position. Madam Chair, does the UNFPA think it can do this because Nauru is the smallest member state of the United Nations?
The interests of organizations like UNFPA and IPPF is to get parents out of the picture and to radicalize and sexualize children. At the UN, if parental rights is being proposed in a document, it's thrown out.
A report by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, issued to the UN General Assembly, claimed that children have a right to comprehensive sexuality education, aimed, among other things, at abolishing guilt feelings about eroticism, and that will teach about the importance of sexual diversity.
In comprehensive sexuality education, the approach is to celebrate sexual freedom or sexual license, to celebrate experimenting from a medical perspective. When sexual freedom is the priority, then sexual health is going to suffer. You just can't have it both ways.
If a sexual education program is teaching a child or leading a child towards multiple sexual relations, early introduction to sexual intercourse, it is, by the data, a public form of sexual abuse. Out-of-wedlock births are going to skyrocket. They're going to have many more abortions. They're going to have much more STDs. The probability of depressions and anxiety directly out of matters sexual increase very significantly.
So our country had a secret visit from the U.S. Special Envoy for LGBT Rights, Mr. Randy Berry. He was accompanied by the Senior LGBT Coordinator for USAID, Mr. Todd Larkin, to try and see what the Jamaican climate was regarding sexual rights and how they could influence change. We were able to notify the public about this visit and to send a very clear message to the U.S. government that Jamaica will not be pressured into changing our values and our culture that protects the family.
The Center for Disease Control, in their own research, shared information that 2% of the population of the US are men who have sex with men. And of that 2%, they account for 68% of the HIV infection. And the government of the United States spends $12 billion annually just to take care of that. I actually had to say to them that Jamaica cannot afford to spend that kind of money.
One of the handouts that concerns me the most is called the Genderbread Person. They teach that gender is a spectrum, that you can choose to be whatever you want. You could be all female one day and the next day feel like you're neither female or male.
Frankly, it's confusing. It's mental molestation. We're confusing these kids as to what they are.
The greatest medical fraud in history is to tell someone that they can change gender. I lived as Laura Jensen for 8 years. I discovered that biologically it is categorically impossible to change a man into a woman. My life was completely torn apart.
We have a whole specialty in medicine called gender-specific medicine. Did you know there's male and female kidneys, male and female hearts? If there's a woman who needs a kidney transplant, she will do better with a kidney transplant from a woman, because a kidney from a male, every cell in that kidney is going to have a Y chromosome. When we prescribe medications now, is this patient male or female? Because the reaction to the medication may differ.
Leading young children down the path of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and mutilating surgeries places them at a greater risk of developing high blood pressure, stroke, heart attacks, cancer, relationship problems, anxiety, depression, and suicide as adults.
There are laws in Oregon where children as young as 15 can get taxpayer-funded sex changes without parental consent. You can't have an aspirin at school without parental consent. However, a student could make these life-altering, permanent decisions without their parental knowledge or consent.
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association reports that as many as 98% of boys who are confused about their identity will come to accept their biological sex by the time they are adults, as long as they are not encouraged in their confusion.
They're tampering with the core identity of these young people and confusing them.
This is the enemy of my children and my grandchildren. And it's digging down into the core of being male and female, of our identity as persons, of our family life, of our children.
The Minnesota State High School League created policy in sports which broke down the barriers of what gender identity actually is. They are no longer allowed to tell students you can or you cannot use a particular bathroom.
The girls in the school that would actually try sometimes to go into the bathrooms just to get away from a boy, but now that's no longer possible because these boys can follow them right in.
Comprehensive sexuality education programs are disguised under many names. They may be called comprehensive sex or sexual education, education on human sexuality, reproductive health education, information on sexual and reproductive health, family life education, teen pregnancy prevention, rape prevention, anti-bullying programs, HIV/AIDS prevention, and sometimes even abstinence or abstinence plus education. CSE programs usually falsely claim to be age-appropriate, evidence-based, healthy sexuality education that will prevent teen pregnancy, sexual abuse, STDs, and HIV.
This is to help people, young people, avoid the dangers of HIV/AIDS in South Africa. And they were telling them how they could have non-penetrative sex, oral sex, experimenting, how this is helping people to avoid HIV/AIDS.
This pamphlet, or zine as they call it, is called Dry Humping Saves Lives. This means abstinence. So they suggest that children masturbate or masturbate in front of a mirror or in front of one another. Anal sex, oral sex, grinding, sleeping together, caressing, sexting. They suggest sexting, which would be getting your groove on, fluid-free. And again, this is abstinence to them, so they're actually encouraging sexual experience for children and calling it abstinence.
Sexual rights, sexual education movements began with Dr. Alfred C. Kinsey. He was a professor at Indiana University. His book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, purported to say that everyone in the world was engaged in massive sexual promiscuity, that it was a global pattern of sexual behavior. Kinsey claimed that the research published in his book proved that children are sexual from birth, that children could engage in sex with no downside, no problem at all. Kinsey actually had pedophiles measure with a stopwatch how many children could achieve what he called orgasms within a 24-hour period. In his book, Kinsey defines orgasm for these children as fainting, as having convulsions, as screaming, as fighting to get away from the partner, what he called the partner. Kinsey documented the sexual abuse of children. Table 34 documents the sexual abuse by pedophiles of children from 5 months of age to 13 years, 317 children in that one table alone. The so-called research then, exploitation of these children, became the philosophies behind the entire structure of modern sexual education globally. Today, comprehensive sexuality education is based on this philosophy that children are sexual from birth, created by Kinsey.
3 main organizations that promote Kinsey's harmful sexual philosophies are the Kinsey Institute, Planned Parenthood, and the Sexuality Information and Education Council of the United States, also known as SIECUS. In fact, Mary Calderon, the main founder of SIECUS, was the former medical director for Planned Parenthood, and a former Kinsey Institute director, Wardell Pomeroy, was also a founding board member of SIECUS. These 3 organizations are all accredited by the United Nations and use their UN status to promote Kinsey-based sexuality education to children across the world.
Say no to CSC! Say no to CSC! Say no to CSC! Say no to CSC!
We have tried to stop it. We have tried to break the consensus and ensure that comprehensive sexuality education has no place in the United Nations agreed language.
We've got to stop it. We've got to use everything at our disposal. We have to stand together to stop this attack against our children.
The material was exposed by one individual, and the entire nation got wind, and as a result of it, it had to be withdrawn.
Every well-thinking adult must be vigilant and must stand as a gatekeeper to our children's development.
Band together and find ways to stop it from entering your country.
We are trying to stop Planned Parenthood in Guatemala, and they have all this funding and this organization, but we know that if we stand together, we can do something for the family, for the children, for the future of the world.
We're in a battle. If this has not come to your state in a full way, I can tell you it's come to Minnesota, and we deal with it every single day.
As elected officials, if we can't rise and stand up and speak out on behalf of our children, our innocent children, what are we even doing? What are we even doing here?
We stopped the Kinsey Sexuality Education program in Croatia. I went to Croatia. I held up the Kinsey books in Parliament. I described to them the basis of the Kinsey books and held up the children of Table 34. And the Constitutional Court banned that sex education program.
The American College of Pediatricians wants policymakers to understand this. When considering a sexuality education policy, be certain you specify that it be a sexual risk avoidance program. You must reject comprehensive sexuality education. We want to teach children to avoid all the risks, 100% of the risks, by avoiding early sexual behavior.
These people, whoever they are, who want to make the sexual only about the pleasure, are working to destroy everything we are building. We resist it, even with our lives, because that's what life is all about. It is time for parents to say, no, my family is mine. My wife is mine. I am hers. Our children are ours. They don't belong to the state. And people of different faiths can easily band together on this. I may be a devout Muslim. I understand this. I'm a devout Mormon. I understand this. I'm a devout Roman Catholic. I'm a devout evangelical. On this parental issue, we are all together.
Just understand, it's happening on our watch. If we don't do something about it, it is all of us that carry that guilt.
Men have to rise up, defend their family. On matters sexual, the fathers have got to stand up. Say, you have no place talking sexuality to my children.
We must let the world know the roots of this radical, destructive Keynesian sexuality education. That is the only way we will be able to stop the corruption, the destruction of the world's children.
Family Watch International invites good people from all around the world to join us in this worldwide battle to protect the health and innocence of children. To learn more and to sign the petition to stop comprehensive sexuality education, go to stopcsc.org. You can also help by encouraging others to watch the documentary and sign the petition as well. Together, we can and will protect the world's children.
The time has come. The time